So today's daf is daf Yud Beis, and we got up to Gufa, which is 4 lines down from the top. Ra osan rotzim achar Metziya. So the Mishnah says that if you have an animal that's hefker that comes through your chotzer, and in this case the animal is lame, it means the legs are broken, that's called tzvi shvura, or you have gosel shalaparchu, so that the birds are not flying, they're baby birds. So in this case, his chotzer could be kona on his behalf. Yesterday we had a long discussion as to whether or not chotzer operates midin yad or midin shliach. And the truth of the matter is, for our purposes today, that issue is irrelevant. It's a very theoretical issue that was relevant yesterday in terms of a katan and a katana. But now we're talking about the owner of the field, who's a gadol, and his chotzer could be kona on his behalf. So the Gemara says, Gufa, here on Daf Yud Beis, that the Mishnah clearly indicates that since the animal is moving very slowly, and it's in his chotzer, and it's hefker, then chatzero shel adam kona lo shalom midaita. That automatically his chotzer should be kona. What we're going to have to discuss is that the Mishnah adds a stipulation that he declares that zachsali chatzeri. He wants his chotzer to be zoch on his behalf. And the question is, why do we need that? And yesterday we discussed the distinction between two categories of chotzer. There's a chotzer mishtameres, and there's a chotzer she'ena mishtameres. In the case of a chotzer mishtameres, we don't need his participation. He's not an active agent in creating the kinyan chotzer. But in a chotzer she'ena mishtameres, we need ome b'tzad sodeu, and we need that he declare that his chotzer should be zoch on his behalf. Omer Rab Yirmiyah, Omer Rab Yochanan, v'hu sherotz achreim umagion. These animals, although they move at a slow pace, the question now is, can he, the owner of the field, reach the animal before the animal leaves the field? Because again, even though the animal is lame, it does move, and in the case of these birds, we have medadados, they are moving along. So the critical element here is that he could reach the animal before it leaves the chotzer. Now, nowhere do we require that before, in actuality, he has to be there and grab the animal, but we measure it in such a way that if we come to the conclusion that he could reach the animal, the potential is there, then the chotzer is tofeses, it grabs and sees the animal on his behalf. But Rabbi Yirmiyah has another question. Boy, Rabbi Yirmiyah b'matana hech. Maybe there's a distinction to be drawn between a case of hefker and the case of a matana. And let's explain. As we saw yesterday on Daf Yud Aleph, in the name of Rav Papa, there's a concept called das acheres makna, which means that every kinyan requires two participants, the makna and the kona. The makna has das makna, and the kona das kona. And then there's a Masechet kinyan, and that clinches the kinyan. However, in the case of hefker, what happens is there's no das makna. So everything depends upon the kona. In the case, however, of matana, there's a makna, and the das makna now is going to supply that which we need to create a tfisa. And we mentioned in the name of the Rishonim yesterday that the makna himself will protect the object to make sure that no one else grabs it and takes hold of it before the Baal Bayis. Because the Nosei Matana is only interested in the Baal HaChotzer, that he should make the kinyan. So in a certain sense, we could say that the Das Makna replaces the need for the Baal HaBayis to be actively tofes, or in this case, the Chotzer, as an extension of the Baal HaBayis to be tofes. So even though there are no fences around the Chotzer, And Rabbi Yirmiyah presents the possibility that even if the animal will leave the chotzer, it will exit from the soda before the Baal Soda will get a hold of it. Even so, through das acheres makna, in the case of matana, the kinyan will be clinched and it will be valid, even if it's eno magia, even if he won't be able to reach the animal before it leaves. And the Gemara tells us that kibla minei Rabbi Abba bar Kahana. And Rabbi Abba accepted that logical distinction, Rabbi Yirmiyah, that in the case of das acheres makna matana, you don't need rotz achrem magia, but rather afal pisha rotz achrem v'ein magia. Even if he runs and he will not be able to seize the animal before it leaves the chotzer, nevertheless the chotzer is kona on his behalf, but not in hefker. For that we need rotz achrem magion, but in the case of matana das acheres makna. Boy Rava now raises the following question. Zorak arnaki bepesach zeh, the yotza bepesach acher mahu. We have a halach in chotzer that the avir of the chotzer is equivalent to the chotzer itself. The airspace of a chotzer, this is sugya in Perkas Zorek in Masechet Gittin, the airspace of a chotzer is considered as if it was on the ground. So, for example, if an object was flying through the air of my chotzer and you want to grab the object before I do, you cannot do so. The chotzer was kona midin avir chotzer. However, Rava has a suffix. What about a case of avir she'ein sofo lanuach? The reason why avir is an extension of the chotzer, and the bala chotzer could be kona, an object that's flying through the airspace of his chotzer, is because through the law of gravity, we know that eventually the object is going to fall down and land on the ground, on the karka of the chotzer. But Rava's question is, what happens if we know that the object will never actually land on the ground? It will go from one point in the avir to another point in the avir until it exits the chotzer, and it will never fall on the chotzer. And therefore, mal, avir shein sofo lanuach. How do we treat a case of avir which is not going to end up and culminate in the object falling to the ground? Is it kimunach dami? Shall we assume that it's as if it was there on the ground? Oh, lo, no, it's just flying through the airspace. It has no real connection to the ground of the chotzer. And this, my friends, is really a sugya in Masechta Shabbos in the first parak with regard to Meleches Hotzah. And Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that kluta kamisha hunchadami, that something that goes through the avir, let's say of a Rishus HaYachid, is considered as if it's on the ground of Rishus HaYachid, or for that matter, Rishus HaRabban. However, we have a shita Ben Azai. Ben Azai says, mahalech ka'omei dami, that if you're carrying something through a rishus and your feet land on the ground, because every time you take another step, your leg is attached to the ground, then anything that you're carrying in your hand is considered kimunach agavi karka. But it's not enough to say kluta kamisha huncha, that because it's flying through the airspace, therefore it's kimunach agavi karka. And Rava wants to know, do these same rules that apply to Meleches Hotzah and Shabbos apply to Kinyanim? And the Gemara tells us, Amalei Rav Papa Rava, the Amri Le, others say it was Rav Adabar Masna Rava, others say Amri Le Ravina Rava, Lav Hainu Masnisin. In other words, shouldn't we introduce Rav Yirmiyah and his interpretation of our Mishnah? Because our Mishnah says, Metziya, right? And if he cannot reach it before it leaves the ground of his chotzer, then he's not konen. But Rabbi Yirmiyah limits that and he restricts it. He says, Rabbi Yochanan, boy Rabbi Yirmiyah matana hech, v'kibla minei Rav Abba bar Kahana. What's going to happen here is that Rabbi Yomi is going to say that matana is different than hefker. And in the case of matana, we're going to apply the principle of das acheres mak. And now Rav Papa, through his understanding of das acheres makna, is going to apply Rav Yirmiyah's svara to the case of avir she'ein sofa lanua. Umbatana afal pisha rotzach rev v'ein magil. Rav Yirmiyah, after all, and Rav Abba accepted Rav Yirmiyah, set up the distinction that you don't need magia, you don't need the tfis of the balachotzer in a case where there's das acheres makna like matana, and the das acheres of the nosein matana will supply the tfisa even if the object is not going to remain in that chotzer. It's leaving the chotzer, and the balachotzer will not be able to seize the object, but it's as if there's a tfisa on the object based on the fact that there was das acheres makna. And therefore, you're worried, Rava, that if it's avir she'ein sof lanuach and it's flying through the airspace, but it's going to land outside the boundaries of the chotzer, then there's no tfisa. The chotzer is not being tofes on behalf of the balasada. The answer is no. The tfisa can be supplied by the das acheres makna in the case of matana. Amalei, so Rava said, you know what? You're starting your analysis with an analogy to a case of our Mishnah. That's not a fair analogy. Misgalgil ka'amrit. The case of the animal is like the case that we mentioned before of Ben Azai of Mahalech ka'omedam. Because the animal, even though it's lame, or in the case of the Gozol Shalaparchu that are medadados, its feet land on the ground every time it moves. And therefore, there's a connection here between the ground of the chotzer and the animal that's going through the chotzer. But my question, says Rava, was about avir she'ein sofa lanua, which means that it's really not touching the ground at all. It's just passing through the airspace of the chotzer. And now we get to the Mishnah here on Daf Yud Beis. Metziya beno ubito aktanim. Now, the Mishnah is going to enumerate a number of cases where a person could be kona an object of hefker through an agent. For example, beno ubito aktanim. So let's say I have a young child, and he picks up a lost object, makes a kinyan akbar, and that kinyan akbar will now relate to me as the father, as if I had made the kinyan akbar, and I'm kohen. Or mitzias avdo v'shivchaso aknanim. In the case of an eved or a shivcha, again, we have to emphasize that we're talking about ktanim in the first case of Metzias beno bito ktanim, and in the second case we're talking about an eved or a shivcha knanis. So we're talking either about a katan or an eved knani. We'll explain why that's so relevant in just a few minutes. Or Metzias ishto. Let's say his wife finds an object that's hefker. Her hagba as a Maisa Kinyan relates now to her husband. So this is one of the nice aspects of being married. Nobody laughed. Anyway, Harei Elu Shalom. No, in all those cases, you're Zochim. Mitzias Bito Bino Hakgedolim. But if, on the other hand, the child is already past bar mitzvah, and therefore he has a yad to be zocha in a kinyan or hagba for himself, or mitzias avdo v'shivchaso ha'ivrim, if the eved is not an eved knani, whose yad is the yad of the balabayis, of the adon, of the rab, but rather he's an eved ivri, and eved ivri has his own yad, he makes his own kinyanim on his own behalf, and the owner of the eved is not zocha. Metzias ishto shegirsha. Now, you would ask me, well, if it's after Gerushin, then for sure, her kinyan goes without saying, is for her own behalf. But afal pishalo nosan ksuba. The Gemara is going to discuss the monetary rights of a Baal through the ksuba, and one of those rights is that Metzias ishto Baal, and we might have extended that even after Gerushin, as long as the ksuba is still valid. Now, is there any validity to a ksuba after Gerushin? That in Mirza Hashem will be a sugya in the Gemara.
We'll also talk about the case with regards to her if he doesn't give her mamona, that she's.
Okay. There's going to be a case where there's no ava because the entire ksuba is built on quid pro quo. The Gemara says Amar Shmuel mipnei ma amru mitzias katan li aviv. Now watch the word amru. The word amru here indicates that we're dealing with a takanas chachamim. And as you know, just to repeat the basics, with regard to dini momenos, the Rabbanan have absolute authority. What's that called? Hefker, bezdin hefker. So therefore, amru, they decided that the kinyan, which would not be valid on a doraisa level, because a katan does not have a yad l'kinyanim doraisa, will be operative and valid on a Rabbanan level. Why did the Rabbanan do that? And why did they establish that when the katan picks up a lost object, that's hefker, he is zocha with his hagbah on behalf of his father? And the answer is shebishor shemotza meritza etzel aviv v'eino mi'acher biyado. A child will naturally find a lost object and bring it to his father and give it to his father. And the Rabbanan wanted to establish a kinyan d'Rabbanan such that the kinyan of the son would now accrue on behalf of his father, because otherwise the Rabbanan were afraid there are going to be fights. You know, this child picked it up, somebody else is, please close the door if you don't mind, thank you. And there are going to be fights, asil in suye in the Lashon of Shas, so that's what they made the takon. Now, when a katan picks up an aveda, which is hefker, since he gives it to his father, Rabbanan established that his yad is like the yad of the father. But that's only a kinyan d'Rabbanan. So the Gemara says, "Lebeber de Savar Shmuel katan lesle schil lenafshe midoraisa." Let me explain. The underlying premise of the Gemara's question is that, you know what, a kinyan on a katan's part is valid d'oraisa. The underlying premise of this Gemara is very, very difficult. A katan does not have a yad, but the Gemara thinks that a katan could be zocha d'oraisa. How is that possible? Again, if Rav Papa was here in the room, he would say, in a case of matana, there was das acheres makna. But here we're talking about a case of hefker. So there is no das acheres makna. And yet the Gemara insists that based on a psak of Shmuel, in which he paskins like Rabbi Yossi, we'll see Rabbi Yossi in just a minute, Shmuel's of the opinion that a katan could be zocha de'oraisa. Ellen. And where do we see this? This we see in the laws of leket. Leket is one of the matanos le'laniyim. And the Brisa says, Vatanya socher es hapoel, yelaket b'no achrov. Now watch what goes on. A poel works in one of two categories. There's a poel who is just being paid for his work. He gets wages. There's another kind of poel, which is also called an oris, who is a part owner. He becomes a partner in the field, and he does not only the work, but he gets a certain percentage in the fruits of his labor. Now, the difference is going to be that the Torah prohibits a balabayas from collecting leket, as we saw yesterday with regard to shichacha, lotashiv lekachta, separate lot. And now, if the poel is going to be a balabayas, then there's no way that he can pick up the leket and take it for himself. That would be a violation of Allah. However, If, on the other hand, it's a regular classic poel, and he's not a partner, he's not an oris, he's not getting neither mechza, shlish, or a via, a cut, a certain percentage of the tvu, of the produce, then he could be an ani, and an ani is allowed to collect leket shikram peah. And therefore, in the classic poel, is Yalaket Beno Achrov. The child could now pick up the peah and bring it to his father, who's the poel. However, not in the case of Mechza Shlish Uravil or Yalaket Beno Achrov. Now let's think about it. Is the kinyan of the katan doraisa or derabana? If it's doraisa, then why can't the child pick up the leket? He's an ani. Even his father is an ani, just that his father is a balabayit because he owns part of the field in the case of lemechza l'shlishu avia. But so what? Let the katan be zoche on his own behalf. If his kinyan is doraisa, he's an ani. He has a right to take leket shikum peah, and then he can decide what he wants to do with it. If he wants to give that leket as a gift to the balabayit, in this case to his father, the poel, who's an aris and he's a balabait, then he's allowed to do so. So why does the Mishnah say it's not allowed? And the answer is because the Tanakama, we'll soon see Rabbi Yossi who dissents, is of the opinion that a katan does not have a yad da'oraisa, so it's only an extension of his father's yad. He cannot be zocha for himself. And if his father is a poel of the type of lemechza l'shlishu revia, and therefore that makes him a balabais, he cannot be zoch on behalf of his father with a direct kinyan that goes from him to his father, because then it's like the father's a balabayit is picking up the leket, which he's not allowed to do. However, Rabbi Yossi Omer, ben kachu ben kach yelaket b'no ve'ishto achron. Rabbi Yossi holds, according to our sugya now, later on the Gemara is going to change, that the zechia of a katan is doraisa, and a katan has a yad to be zoche and leket on a doraisa level. Now, when he picks up the leket, it's his. He's an ani, and he's allowed to pick it up. And then he can decide who he wants to give it to. If he wants to give it to his father, who is the balabayit in this case, he's like an ashir, then that's fine. Once he was zoche for himself, he can give it to anyone he likes, even the balabayits. V'yomer Shmuel lachik Rabbi Yossi. So Shmuel is now going on record and committed to the fact that a katan has a yad da'oraisa to be kona. We can understand Rabbi Yossi because even though the father, the poel, is a balabayit, he's a part owner of the field, his son, according to Rabbi Yossi, could be zoche in the leket for himself and then give it over as a gift. He decides to give it as a gift to his father. That's fine. If the Torah doesn't recognize the yad of a katan to make a kinyan that's valid on behalf of himself, then then really we're going with the assumption that the katan is now an extension of his father. And really he's picking it up. It's like his father's picking it up. Well, I got news for you. The father can't take the leket. Please pay attention that the word asher here does not mean that he's a rich person. He's not rich at all. The word asher means that he's mufka. He's excluded from being zochen leket because he's the balabayit in the case of lemechza, etc. So the Gemara tries to get out of this by saying that Shmuel, Taima ditana didan ka'om, v'lei lo svirle. Okay, you want to find the steer here in Shmuel? No. There's no contradiction in Shmuel because Shmuel was only saying that a katan could be zoch on behalf of his father based on the Tan of HaMishnah. So that means the katan does not have a zchia dorais, he doesn't have a yad, but the Rabbanan linked him up with his father. However, Shmuel himself did not accept the Shita of the Tanakama. He accepted the Shita of Rabbi Yossi. And therefore, if you ask Shmuel, what's the nature of the yad of a katan? The answer is it's Doraisa. Now the Gemara gets down to brass tacks. Come on. You got to be kidding me. This is not a funny joke. You're going to tell me that a katan has a yad to be zocheh Doraisa? Nobody could say such a thing. And the Gemara proves it from the Mishnah in Gittin. Besava Rabbi Yossi katan islay schia Doraisa v'atanan Metziya schei reshota v'katan yesh b'hem mishum gezel midivrei mipnei darkei shalom. The Rambanan established that when a katan picks up a lost object or any object of hefker, then it's his. Why is it his? Because the Rabbanan said it's his. And why did they do such a thing? Darkei shalom, they don't want people jumping on top of each other, fighting to get it out of, wrestle it out of the hands of the katan. And Rabbi Yossi Omer, Gezel Gamur. Wow, that sounds good. That sounds like we're really talking about Schia Doraisa. But Rav Chizda, what did Rabbi Yossi have in mind? Gezel Gamur Midivreim, that the Rabbanan recognize the kinyan of the katan. If somebody grabs it from the katan, he violates what's called Gezel Midivreim, and Nafkemina Lo Tzia V'Dayanim. So there's a difference between Darkei Shalom, which is just a matir, so to speak, that allows recognizing, so to speak, the kinyan of the katan, but it's not a real full-fledged kinyan, and there's no gzeil if somebody steals it from him. But Rabbi Yossi says, no, it is considered midrabanan gezel, such that now it's motzia b'dayanim. He could now sue for damages. Again, I don't know how a katan, that's a problem exactly, how a katan could be toveh, but whatever it is. And now we come to the conclusion that Rabbi Yossi holds that Einoch Hinami, the kinyan of a katan is only derabana. It's gezel midivreim. And, now at this point, we really have a contradiction, because if Rabbi Yossi holds that a katan doesn't have a yad doraisa, then how could Rabbi Yossi go on record as holding that even in the case of a poel who has bailus on the sada, his son could be zoche for his father on a drabanan level in leket? How could the father be zoche in leket? He's a balabai. Elo Amar Abaye says, you know what? Let's try to find an entirely different approach. This is the creative mind of Abaye, very original, to try to understand how it is that Rabbi Yossi could allow the son of the Balabayit to make a kinyan in leket on behalf of his father in a direct kinyan that goes to his father, and his father's a Balabayit, because the Mechzel Ishlish Levia makes him into a Balabayit. How could that possibly be? And the Abai comes up with a whole nother approach, whole different perspective. The aniyim gufayu masche datai. Now, before I bother translating the words of the Gemara literally, I want to introduce here a chiddush of Rabbi Elchanan Vasim in Zechat Tzadik and Kodesh L'Bracha. Rabbi Elchanan says the following, that leket, or any matnas andiyah, and we have something parallel, matnas kahuna, is not mammon that's owned by one individual. The ani has not yet acquired ownership. Ploni almoni has not yet made a kinyan on the leket. So the leket and matnas aniyim are owned by an entire group, so to speak. It's sort of like a corporate ownership, a collective ownership. And Rabbi Elchanan says that with regard to a collective ownership, there's something called hesech hadas. Now, hesech hadas, which means giving up hope, is what's called in the Lumdisha jargon siluk. Siluk means when I remove myself from any ownership. Normally, siluk is not operative. It's not effective. You can't be misalik yourself. Let's say I own this scarf, right? It's probably not going to help me in minus 10 degrees wind chill factor. But anyway, if I own this scarf and now I say, I'm masalik myself from this scarf, nothing happened, nothing registered. You have to do a hakna, a kinyan. However, says Rav Elchanan, that's because I have private ownership over the object. If it's a corporate ownership, then siluk is enough to effectuate a hafkas bailus. I can remove my bailus through siluk, and that's called hesech hadas. So with regard to the aniyim, they could do what's called hesech hadas and be mesalik themselves from the leket shikupeh. At what point would they be mesiach das? After all, an ani wants to collect leket, but he gives up hope. He despairs because holchu bo hanemushos, which means that the elderly people who are the last to go through the field and they walk with a cane and they look on the ground, and they look for every little last piece of leket shikupeh that might have gotten left behind. At this point, all the aniyim who are outside the sada, about to enter into the sada, they say, you know what? There's not a chance that it's not worth our effort to try to find leket shikupeh. The nemushos cleaned out the entire field. There's nothing left. And therefore, when a poel goes with his son, and the son is going to pick up the leket shikupeh on behalf of his father, then even though that kinyan is not valid on a doraisa level, it does trigger off what we call hesech hadas. And therefore, Savri, all the aniyim are of the opinion, they anticipate that the son of so-and-so, of this poel, he's going to collect all the leket. So at that point, they give up hope, and they're masalik, and once they're masalik themselves, then there's no problem of taking moment aniyim. No one is stealing from the aniyim because the aniyim already reached hesech hadas. Amalei Rav Adavar Masel Abaye v'chi mutar li'odem laharbitz hari b'tol sadeh k'dei sheyiru aniyim v'yifrachu. Are you going to say that morally this is acceptable behavior, that we're going to allow the poel to bring in his son or maybe his children in order to generate a hesech hadas? I mean, after all, the Torah wants the leket shikupeh to go to the aniyim. And now you're artificially creating a situation in which there'll be hesech hadas and the aniyim will give up hope and they'll remove themselves from the leket shikupeh. We can't allow it. El Amarov. So at this point, the Gemara has to reinterpret Rabbi Yossi. The first interpretation of Rabbi Yossi, that a kata could be zoche doraisa, was rejected because of the Mishnah Gittin that says that Metziya's katan is only mishum gezel d'Rabbanan, darki shalom. The second answer to explain Rabbi Yossi, namely that of Abai of hesech hadas, is also being rejected because you're being marbitz and ari b'tol sadeu. And now we have a third answer, which is offered by Rav.